When I close my eyes and let my mind wander back, I can still see the little house in Florida where I raised my children, and I can almost hear the sounds of those days, the screen door slamming as they ran in and out, the giggles and shouts of play, the clatter of dishes as I worked in the kitchen, and even the hum of the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead on those long summer afternoons. And oh, how my heart was full in those times, because even though we didn't have much money, we had each other, and that felt like more than enough for me. And I remember how every morning I would wake before the sun had fully risen, the air still damp with dew, and I would put on a pot of coffee for my husband and start breakfast, maybe eggs, maybe biscuits if I had flour to spare, sometimes just toast and butter, but no matter what it was, I tried to make it warm and ready for my family, and then one by one, my children would stumble in, still sleepy-eyed, rubbing their faces with their little hands, and they would sit down at the table, swinging their legs that didn't quite reach the floor, and they would ask me what we were having. And just the sound of their voices, soft and bright in the early morning light, made every bit of work worth it. My husband would take his coffee, kiss me on the cheek, and head out the door to work, and then I'd send the children off to school with their lunches, wrapped carefully in wax paper, nothing fancy, but always packed with love, and I would wave from the porch as they walked down the road, their small backpacks bouncing against their shoulders, and I would whisper a little prayer that the day would be kind to them. The afternoons were always busy, and I would try to keep up with the laundry, the sweeping, the mending, and I often did small jobs for neighbors, sewing or cleaning to earn a few extra dollars, because raising children meant there was always one more thing to pay for. But no matter how tired I was, my spirit lifted the moment I heard the sound of their voices again, calling out as they came home from school, their feet running fast up the walkway, and they would burst through the door, dropping their books, talking all at once, and I would stand there smiling, listening to every little detail, because to a mother's ears nothing sounds sweeter than her children's stories. Evenings were my favorite part of the day, when the sun would set in streaks of gold and pink behind the palm trees, and we would all gather at the table, no matter what. Even if I only had beans and rice or a pot of stew, we sat down together, and I believed that sharing food, no matter how simple, was the heart of family. And while they ate and laughed, I would just sit quietly sometimes, watching them, soaking it all in, because I knew those moments were precious and I wanted to hold on to them forever. I think back to the birthdays, the ones we celebrated right there in our backyard, with balloons tied to the fence and a cake I baked from scratch, not perfect, but sweet enough to make their eyes light up, and I can still hear the sound of them singing and blowing out their candles, and the way my heart swelled with pride as I clapped for them. And the Christmas mornings, too, when we didn't have much money, but I would sew dolls or knit scarves, and the children never cared that the gifts weren't new or shiny. They hugged me tight and told me thank you, and in that moment I felt richer than anyone in the world. Florida could be hard sometimes, with the storms rolling in fast and strong, rattling the windows and knocking out the power. But even then we made it something to smile about, lighting candles, telling stories, playing little games until the thunder faded. And I always thought to myself that no storm could ever truly harm us as long as we had each other. Those years were not easy in the ways the world counts ease, because there were bills we struggled to pay, clothes I patched over and over again, nights I went without to make sure they had enough. But in my heart, I felt blessed because my home was full of life, and I told myself that no matter what else happened, as long as I had my family around me, I had everything I needed. I gave them my best every single day, every meal cooked, every prayer whispered, every sacrifice made quietly, and I believed with all my heart that they would always remember that love, that it would hold them close to me forever. Back then, I never imagined a time when those rooms would fall silent, when the laughter would fade, when the chairs at the table would sit empty, because when you are in the middle of joy, you think it will last forever. And I suppose that is why those memories are both sweet and painful to me now, because they were so full, so alive and so fleeting, and if I could live them all over again, I would. Just to hear those voices calling my name one more time. As the years went by, I began to notice little changes in my children. Changes that at first seemed small and harmless, but later grew into something I could no longer ignore. And it all started so quietly, so slowly, like the tide slipping out before you even realize the water is gone. And I remember how dinners, which used to be the highlight of our days, began to feel different because instead of all of us sitting together, talking and laughing, there were more empty chairs, one saying they had homework, another going out with friends, and soon the table that once rang with voices became quiet, and I would find myself eating with only one or two, or sometimes even alone, trying to tell myself it was just a phase, just the way young people are. But in my heart, I felt the sting of it, and it left me sitting longer at the table after the meal was over, staring at the empty chairs and wishing for the sound of chatter again. I remember how they used to come rushing home from school, dropping their books and running to me with stories about their day. But little by little those stories grew shorter, until one day they hardly told me anything at all, and instead they would go straight to their rooms, closing the doors behind them, and I would stand there in the hallway for a moment, staring at those closed doors, holding on to the quiet that pressed down on me. And though I wanted to knock, I didn't because I thought, maybe they just needed space, and I didn't want to push them further away. Holidays changed too, because when they were younger they would decorate with me, hanging tinsel, baking cookies, singing along to the old records I played. But as they grew older, they seemed more distracted, more eager to be somewhere else. And while I still put up the tree and baked the cookies, I could feel their hearts weren't really there the way they once had been. And I would smile anyway, hiding the ache inside, because I didn't want them to see the sadness in my eyes. Birthdays came and went with less excitement too. And I remember one year when I baked a cake and set the table. But one of my children never even came home to eat it, saying later they had gone out with friends instead. And though I said it was all right, that I understood, I went to bed that night with tears on my pillow, missing the days when a birthday meant laughter in our little backyard. I began to feel invisible in my own home, like my presence didn't matter the way it once had, and sometimes when I tried to start a conversation, they would answer with only a few words, their eyes on the clock or on the door. And though I wanted to beg them to sit and talk with me the way they used to, I stayed quiet because a mother's heart is soft, and I was afraid if I held too tightly, they would pull away even more. My husband noticed too, though he said little, only that children grow and change, and that's the way of life. But I saw the way his eyes lingered on their empty seats at the table, and I knew he felt the loss as deeply as I did, even if he didn't speak of it. Nights grew lonelier, and I would lie awake listening to the hum of the ceiling fan, remembering the sound of small feet running through the hall, the laughter spilling into every corner of the house, and I would wonder where those years had gone, how those little arms that once wrapped so tightly around my neck had learned so quickly to let go. I told myself it was normal, that all children must grow up, must find their own way, and I was proud of them for becoming independent. But pride doesn't take away the ache, and I felt as though I was standing on the shore, watching them drift further and further out, unable to call them back. I tried to keep traditions alive, to plan family dinners, to suggest beach walks or movie nights, but more often than not there was an excuse, a reason they couldn't join, and so I sat with my memories instead, telling myself that seasons change, that I had to accept it, even as my heart whispered, I miss them, I miss the way it used to be. And though I smiled and carried on, inside I was mourning the slow, quiet loss of the closeness that once defined my world, and I knew deep down that life was moving us in different directions, whether I was ready or not. I will never forget the day they left, because it is carved into my memory as clearly as if it happened yesterday, and even now when I close my eyes I can see the boxes stacked by the door, the suitcases lined up on the porch, and the sound of car doors opening and closing as they loaded up their things, and I stood there watching, my hands folded together to keep them from shaking, my heart heavy as stone, because I knew once those cars drove away, nothing would ever be the same again. And though they smiled and told me it was just a new chapter, that they would call me and come back often, I could already feel the distance stretching between us, like a road that kept growing longer and longer. I tried to be strong. I tried to smile for them, because I didn't want them to feel guilty or tied down. I wanted them to go with hope in their hearts, but oh, how it hurt standing there on that porch, pretending I was proud and happy, when inside I felt like I was breaking into pieces. I remember walking through the house that morning, looking at the empty bedrooms, the walls still marked with old posters and little scratches from years gone by, and I touched the doorknobs, the windowsills, even the corners of their desks, as if holding on to those small things would somehow hold them here a little longer. But of course it didn't. Nothing could. My husband tried to comfort me, patting my hand and saying, "They'll be back, don't worry." But his eyes looked just as sad as mine, and I knew he was holding his hurt inside the way men often do, because he didn't want me to see it, but I felt it all the same. When the children hugged me goodbye, I clung to them a little longer than usual, breathing them in, memorizing the feel of their arms around me, because I knew I wouldn't have that closeness again for a long time, maybe never in the same way, and I whispered to each one, "I love you, don't forget that," even though my throat was tight and my eyes blurred with tears. They promised they would call, they promised they would visit, they promised nothing would change, but a mother's heart knows when things are already changing. And as I waved from the porch, watching those cars pull away, the dust rising from the tires, I felt a hollowness inside me that I cannot fully describe, a silence louder than any sound, and I stood there long after they were gone, staring down the road as if by sheer will I could bring them back. The house, once so full of life, seemed to sigh around me, every room echoing with memories, and when I walked back inside, the quiet was almost unbearable. The walls felt too wide, the ceilings too high, and I sat at the kitchen table with my hands folded, staring at the empty chairs, and I cried for the first time in a long while, not little tears, but deep sobs that came from a place I didn't even know I had, because I was mourning not just their leaving, but the end of a season in my life, the end of being the center of their world. That night, when the house stayed still and the phone didn't ring, I realized that goodbyes are not just about waving at the door, they're about learning to live with the absence that follows. And as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly, I thought of all the times I had taken their presence for granted, all the times I had wished for just a little peace and quiet, and now I had more silence than I could bear. From that day on, the porch became my waiting place, where I would sit in the evenings, hoping maybe a familiar car would turn into the driveway, hoping maybe I would hear voices calling, "Mama, we're home." But the road stayed empty, and I began to realize that though they had promised to look back, their eyes were fixed on the lives ahead of them, and my little house in Florida was no longer where their hearts lived. After they drove away, the house felt like a different place, as if the walls themselves knew they were gone. And I can tell you, there is no sound as heavy as silence in a home that used to be full of life, because every room carried an echo of what once was, and I would walk from one end to the other, touching the doors, the counters, the chairs, and all I could see were the shadows of memories, the laughter that used to bounce off the walls, the arguments over chores, the footsteps rushing through the hallway, and now all of it had vanished, leaving only stillness that pressed against my chest. The kitchen, which had once been the heart of our home, now felt too large for me, the pots and pans hanging quietly, the table set for just one, and I remember cooking meals out of habit, only to realize halfway through that there was no one to call to the table, no hungry voices asking when dinner would be ready, and I would sit alone, staring at the empty chairs, picking at my food, and sometimes leaving it untouched, because eating alone made me feel lonelier than skipping it altogether. The living room, too, where we once gathered to watch television or play board games during storms, sat untouched, the cushions neat, the blankets folded, no clutter, no signs of use, and I would sit there in the evenings with the lamp on, hearing the hum of the clock ticking, and wonder how a room could feel so empty when it still held all our things. Birthdays came and went without balloons or candles, and I remember one year I baked a small cake just for myself, more out of habit than celebration. And when I sat with it at the table, I whispered a wish, not for anything grand, only for my children to come through the door again, to sit with me just once more the way they used to, but the door never opened, and I blew out the candle with tears in my eyes. Holidays became the hardest, because while other houses on the street filled with cars and laughter, mine stayed quiet, the porch light burning like a beacon that no one answered. And though I still put up a small tree and hung the stockings, the joy I once felt had turned into a quiet ache, because the gifts I had wrapped were never opened here, and the songs I played on the old record player sounded hollow without voices singing along. At night, I would sometimes wake up and for a split second expect to hear them breathing in their rooms, the way I once did when they were children, but the hallway stayed dark and silent, and the only sound was the slow whir of the ceiling fan above me, reminding me that time was passing whether I liked it or not. I took to sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the road as the sun went down, listening to the cicadas and the rustle of palm trees in the breeze, hoping maybe a car would slow down and pull in, hoping maybe they would come back for a visit, but all I ever saw were strangers passing by, and I learned that waiting can be one of the loneliest things in the world when you know deep down no one is coming. Sometimes I would take out the old photo albums, flipping through pages of smiling faces, birthdays, holidays, first days of school. And though those pictures made me smile, they also brought a heavy ache, because the children in those photos were no longer mine to hold close. They had grown and gone, and they didn't look back. I tried to busy myself with little things, tending to the garden, sewing, baking, but even then, every flower I planted and every loaf of bread I pulled from the oven seemed to whisper of who I wished was here to see it. And though I kept telling myself to be strong, some days the loneliness wrapped around me so tight it felt hard to breathe. That old house in Florida had once been bursting with life, but now it was just me and the ticking of the clock, the creak of the floorboards, and the memories that filled the empty spaces. And I realized that losing the noise of family is like losing part of yourself, because it leaves a silence that no radio, no television, no neighbor's visit can ever truly fill. In the beginning, after they left, the phone still rang now and then, and I would hurry to answer it, my heart leaping the moment I heard their voices, because even though they were far away, hearing them made me feel for just a little, well, like they were still close, like I could reach through the line and touch their hands. But as time went on, those calls grew fewer, and the silences between them stretched longer, until weeks slipped into months and months into years, and I found myself sitting by the phone waiting for it to ring the way I once waited for them to walk through the door. At first they would tell me about their new jobs, their new houses, their busy lives, and I would listen with a smile in my voice, though my chest ached with missing them. And I would say, "I'm so proud of you," over and over, because that was true, I was proud, but pride has a way of sitting side by side with loneliness, and when the call ended, the quiet returned heavier than before. Then, one by one, they grew busier, saying they didn't have much time to talk, rushing through conversations, promising to call me back soon, but the callbacks never came, and I began to wonder if maybe they had started to forget the sound of my voice. I remember one holiday I stayed up late by the phone, certain they would call to wish me a Merry Christmas, and I watched the clock hands crawl past midnight, the tree twinkling in the corner. But the phone stayed still, and I finally went to bed with tears on my pillow, whispering to myself that maybe they had just gotten too busy, that maybe tomorrow would be the day. Letters and postcards came at first too, colorful cards with quick words about new cities and new friends, and I held them like treasures, rereading them until the edges grew soft. But even those stopped arriving, and soon the mailbox was empty except for bills and advertisements, none of which carried the warmth of a child's handwriting. I tried calling them myself, and sometimes they would answer, sometimes they wouldn't, and when they did, I could hear the noise of their lives in the background. Children laughing, televisions playing, doors opening and closing, and I realized I was no longer part of the daily rhythm of their world. I was just a voice on the other end of a line, a reminder of the past they had outgrown. One of the hardest moments was the time I heard my grandchild in the background asking, "Who's that?" when I was on the phone, and the answer came back, "It's Grandma," in a tone so casual, as if I were someone they barely knew, and my heart cracked because I wanted to be more than a name. I wanted to be a presence, a memory that mattered. The promises kept coming. "We'll visit soon. We'll come down this summer. We'll spend the holidays with you next year." And I held on to those words like lifelines, believing them even as the summers came and went, the holidays passed, and no one came. I even cleaned the spare rooms and laid out fresh linens, baking pies and cooking favorite meals just in case they surprised me. But the bed stayed untouched, the pies cooled uneaten, and I sat at the table alone, staring at the clock, wondering why promises are so easy to make but so hard to keep. Slowly, I stopped asking when they would visit, because I could hear the hesitation in their voices, the excuses already forming, and I didn't want to make them feel guilty. So instead I said, "That's all right, I understand," even though inside my heart was whispering, "Please, just once, come back." I learned the sound of a phone that didn't ring, of a mailbox that stayed empty, and of a door that no one knocked on. And I carried those silences with me day after day, telling myself over and over that maybe one day things would change. Maybe one day they would look back, but deep down I knew they had turned toward lives that no longer included me in the way I had once hoped. The years went on, and I found myself measuring time not by calendars, but by the empty chairs around my table, the dust that settled on rooms no one entered, and the sound of neighbors' families filling their homes while mine stayed quiet. And I could tell you that nothing makes you feel the weight of loneliness quite like watching other people's joy from the outside. I would see cars pull into driveways up and down the street, trunks opening to spill out children with wide smiles and arms ready to hug their grandparents, and I would stand at my window pretending to water the plants, trying not to let the ache in my chest show on my face. But inside I felt like a tree left without roots, standing but hollow. Sundays were the hardest, because families walked to church together, holding hands, sharing stories, and I walked alone, nodding politely to neighbors who sometimes asked, "When are your children coming to visit?" And I would smile gently and say, "Oh, they're busy these days," as if busyness were enough to explain the silence, though what I wanted to say was, "I don't know any more." Holidays came and went like shadows. Thanksgiving tables where I cooked far too much food but only filled one plate, Christmas mornings where I lit the tree by myself and listened to carols that felt more like laments, and birthdays where the only candle I blew out was the one I lit alone, whispering wishes into an empty room. The years carved deep lines into my face, but it wasn't just age that left its mark. It was the waiting, the hoping, the quiet disappointments that piled up like leaves in autumn, each one a reminder of what was gone. I would sit on the porch in the evenings, rocking gently, watching the sun dip low over the Florida horizon, the sky turning pink and gold, and I thought about all the sunsets I had once shared with my children when they were small, when they would sit on my lap and point at the colors, asking if the sky was painting just for us. Now I watched alone, and the sky still painted its colors, but they felt muted without laughter to fill the air. Sometimes I wondered if they remember me at all, or if I had become like a faded photograph tucked away in a drawer, glanced at once in a while but never really missed, and that thought hurt in a way I cannot fully explain. because a mother never stops remembering her children, never stops holding them in her heart, no matter how far they go or how long they stay away. I found comfort in small routines, tending to the flowers in the garden, baking bread I mostly gave away to neighbors, sewing quilts that no one claimed. But even those tasks carried a bittersweet weight, because every stitch, every loaf, every bloom was something I had once dreamed of sharing with the family that never came back. I went to birthday parties of neighbors' grandchildren, smiling and clapping, but always feeling a pang when I saw the way children ran into their grandparents' arms, because that was a kind of joy I had almost forgotten, a kind of touch I longed for but no longer received. And yet, even as the years stretched out, I kept hope tucked quietly in my heart, like a candle that flickered but never went out, because I couldn't bring myself to believe that they would never return, that they would never look back. And so I carried on, day after day, year after year, waiting with a love that never faded even when it was not returned. Now, as I sit here in the quiet of my little Florida home, the years behind me more than the years ahead, I have learned to make peace with the silence that once felt like a wound, because I realized after all this time that love is not measured by how often the phone rings or how many footsteps cross your threshold, but by the way your heart keeps beating for the ones you love, even when they are far away. I will not lie and say it never hurts, because some nights it still does when the wind rattles the windows and I remember the sound of laughter in these rooms. But I have also found strength in the life I've built for myself, in the neighbors who stop by with kind words, in the garden that blooms faithfully each spring, and in the small joys that remind me the world has not forgotten me, even if my own children seem to. I keep their pictures on the mantel, each one frozen in a moment of time, and I talk to them sometimes, not because I expect them to answer, but because it makes me feel close again. And I've come to understand that a mother's love doesn't expire just because it isn't returned. It lingers, it holds, it forgives. I used to ask myself what I had done wrong, why they moved away and never looked back. But now I see that sometimes life pulls people in directions they cannot resist, and though it feels like abandonment to those left behind, it is not always meant to be cruel. It is just the way of things. I don't carry bitterness in my heart anymore. It's too heavy, and I don't want to leave this world with anger clinging to me. Instead, I choose to be grateful for the years I did have, for the laughter that once filled these rooms, for the tiny hands that once reached for mine, for the memories that are mine to keep even if no one else remembers them. And perhaps that is the gift of growing old. You learn that joy can still live inside sorrow, and that even when life doesn't turn out the way you hoped, there can still be peace. If my children never return, if my grandchildren never know the warmth of my embrace, I will still know that I loved them with everything I had, and in the end that is enough. So I sit on my porch as the sun sets over Florida, rocking gently, the sky painted in colors I never tire of, and I whisper a prayer for them, wherever they are, hoping they are happy, hoping they are safe, hoping that in some quiet corner of their hearts they remember me. And if they don't, if they truly never look back, then at least I can leave this world knowing I never stopped looking forward with love, because that is what a mother does, even when she is forgotten. And in that truth, in that stubborn, unshaken love, I have found my peace.